What does a two-tone test illustrate on an oscilloscope? Linearity of a SSB transmitter. How can a double sideband phone signal be produced? By modulating the supply voltage to a Class C amplifier. What type of signals are used to conduct an SSB two-tone test? Two non-harmonically related audio signals that are within the modulation bandpass of the transmitter. Two non-harmonically related audio signals that are within the modulation bandpass of the transmitter. What is an important factor in pulse code modulation using time division multiplex? Synchronization of transmit and receive clock pulse rates. In a pulse width modulation system, what parameter does the modulating signal vary? Pulse duration. In a pulse width modulation system, what parameter does the modulating signal vary? Pulse duration. What is the name of the type of modulation in which the modulating signal varies the duration of the transmitted pulse? Pulse width modulation. Which of the following best describes a pulse modulation system? The peak transmitter power is normally much greater than the average power. In a pulse position modulation system, what parameter does the modulating signal vary? The time at which each pulse occurs. In a pulse position modulation system, what parameter does the modulating signal vary? The time at which each pulse occurs. What is one way that voice is transmitted in a pulse width modulation system? A standard pulse is varied in duration by an amount depending on the voice waveform at that instant. When a lead-acid storage battery is being charged, a harmful effect to humans is emission of hydrogen gas. A battery with a terminal voltage of 12.5 volts is to be trickle charged at a 0.5 A rate. What resistance should be connected in series with the battery to charge it from a 110 VDC line? 5 ohms. A battery with a terminal voltage of 12.5 volts is to be trickle charged at a 0.5 A rate. What resistance should be connected in series with the battery to charge it from a 110 VDC line? 195 ohms. What capacity in amperes does a storage battery need to be in order to operate a 50-watt transmitter for 6 hours? Assume a continuous transmitter load of 70% of the key lock demand of 40 A and an emergency light load of 1.5 A. 177 ampere hours. What is the total voltage when 12 nickel-cadmium batteries are connected in series? 15 volts. The average fully charged voltage of a lead-acid storage cell is 2.06 volts. A nickel-cadmium cell has an operating voltage of about 1.25 volts. When an emergency transmitter uses 325 watts and a receiver uses 50 watts, how many hours can a 12.6 volt 55 ampere hour battery supply full power to both units? 1.8 hours. What current will flow in a 6-volt storage battery with an internal resistance of 0.01 ohms when a 3-watt 6-volt lamp is connected? 0.4995 amps. A ship radar unit uses 315 watts and a radio uses 50 watts. If the equipment is connected to a 50 ampere hour battery rated at 12.6 volts, how long will the battery last? 1 hour 43 minutes. If a marine radio telephone receiver uses 75 watts of power and a transmitter uses 325 watts, how long can they both operate before discharging a 50 ampere hour 12-volt battery? 1.5 hours. A 6-volt battery with 1.2 ohms internal resistance is connected across 2 light bulbs in parallel whose resistance is 12 ohms each. What is the current flow? 0.83 amps. A 12.6 volt 8 ampere hour battery is supplying power to a receiver that uses 50 watts and a radar system that uses 300 watts. How long will the battery last? 17 minutes or 0.3 hours. What occurs if the load is removed from an operating series DC motor? It will accelerate until it falls apart. If a shunt motor running with a load has its shunt field opened, how would this affect the speed of the motor? It will speed up. The expression voltage regulation as it applies to a shunt-wound DC generator operating at a constant frequency refers to voltage fluctuations from load to no load. The expression voltage regulation as it applies to a shunt-wound DC generator operating at a constant frequency refers to voltage fluctuations from load to no load. What is the line current of a 7 horsepower motor operating on 120 volts at full load, a power factor of 0.8 and 95% efficient? 57.2 amps. A 3 horsepower, 100 VDC motor is 85% efficient when developing its rated output. What is the current? 26.300 amps. The output of a separately excited AC generator running at a constant speed can be controlled by the amount of field current. Which of the following could cause a high standing wave ratio on a transmission line? A detuned antenna coupler. Why is the value of the radiation resistance of an antenna important? Knowing the radiation resistance makes it possible to match impedances for maximum power transfer. A radio frequency device that allows RF energy to pass through in one direction with very little loss but absorbs RF power in the opposite direction is a isolator. A radio frequency device that allows RF energy to pass through in one direction with very little loss but absorbs RF power in the opposite direction is a isolator. What is an advantage of using a trap antenna? It may be used for multiband operation. What is meant by the term radiation resistance of an antenna? An equivalent resistance that would dissipate the same amount of power as that radiated from an antenna. What is meant by the term radiation resistance of an antenna? An equivalent resistance that would dissipate the same amount of power as that radiated from an antenna. What is meant by the term antenna bandwidth? The frequency range over which an antenna can be expected to perform well. What is the current flowing through a 52 ohm line with an input of 1872 watts? 6 amps. The voltage produced in a receiving antenna is always proportional to the received field strength. Which of the following represents the best standing wave ratio? 1:1. At the ends of a half-wave antenna, what values of current and voltage exist compared to the remainder of the antenna? Maximum voltage and minimum current. An antenna radiates a primary signal of 500 watts output if there is a second harmonic output of 0.5 watt. What attenuation of the second harmonic has occurred? 30 decibels. There is an improper impedance match between a 30-watt transmitter and the antenna with 5 watts reflected. How much power is actually radiated? 25 watts. A vertical 1/4 wave antenna receives signals equally from all horizontal directions. The resonant frequency of a Hertz antenna can be lowered by placing an inductance in series with the antenna. An excited 1/2 wavelength antenna produces both electromagnetic and electrostatic fields. To increase the resonant frequency of a 1/4 wavelength antenna, add a capacitor in series. What happens to the bandwidth of an antenna as it is shortened through the use of loading coils? It is decreased. To lengthen an antenna electrically, add a coil. What is the meaning of the term velocity factor of a transmission line? The velocity of the wave on the transmission line divided by the velocity of light in a vacuum. What is the meaning of the term velocity factor of a transmission line? The velocity of the wave on the transmission line divided by the velocity of light in a vacuum. What determines the velocity factor in a transmission line? Dielectrics in the line. Nitrogen is placed in transmission lines to prevent moisture from entering the line. A perfect coaxial cable has 7 decibels of reflected power when the input is 5 watts. What is the output of the transmission line? 1 watt. Refer to the fundamental frequency. A shorted stud line attached to the transmission line to absorb even harmonics could have a wavelength of 1/4 wavelength. If a transmission line has a power loss of 6 decibels per 100 feet, what is the power at the feed point to the antenna at the end of a 200-foot transmission line fed by a 100-watt transmitter? 6. If a transmission line has a power loss of 6 decibels per 100 feet, what is the power at the feed point to the antenna at the end of a 200-foot transmission line fed by a 100-watt transmitter? 6 watts. What is the effective radiated power of a repeater with 50 watts transmitter power output, 4 decibels feed line loss, 3 decibels duplexer and circulator loss and 6 decibels antenna gain? 39.7 watts. What is the effective radiated power of a repeater with 75 watts transmitter power output, 4 decibels feed line loss, 3 decibels duplexer and circulator loss and 10 decibels antenna gain? 150 watts. What is the effective radiated power of a repeater with 75 watts transmitter power output, 5 decibels feed line loss, 4 decibels duplexer and circulator loss and 6 decibels antenna gain? 37.6 watts. What is the effective radiated power of a repeater with 100 watts transmitter power output, 4 decibels feed line loss, 3 decibels duplexer and circulator loss and 7 decibels antenna gain? 100 watts. What is the effective radiated power of a repeater with 100 watts transmitter power output, 5 decibels feed line loss, 4 decibels duplexer and circulator loss and 10 decibels antenna gain? 126 watts. What is the effective radiated power of a repeater with 50 watts transmitter power output, 5 decibels feed line loss, 4 decibels duplexer and circulator loss and 7 decibels antenna gain? 31.5 watts. What is the frequency range of the distance measuring equipment used to indicate an aircraft's land range distance to a selected ground-based navigation station? 962 MHz to 1213 MHz. The distance measuring equipment measures the distance from the aircraft to the DME ground station. This is referred to as the slant range. The distance measuring equipment ground station has a built-in delay between reception of an interrogation and transmission of the reply to allow operation at close range. What is the main underlying operating principle of an aircraft's distance measuring equipment? A measurable amount of time is required to send and receive a radio signal through the Earth's atmosphere. What radio navigation aid determines the distance from an aircraft to a selected vortex station by measuring the length of time the radio signal takes to travel to and from the station? Distance measuring equipment. The majority of airborne distance measuring equipment systems automatically tune their transmitter and receiver frequencies to the paired/channel VOR/LOC. All directions associated with a VOR station are related to magnetic north. The rate that the transmitted VOR variable signal rotates is equivalent to how many revolutions per second? 30. What is the frequency range of the ground-based very high-frequency omnidirectional range stations used for aircraft navigation? 108.00 MHz to 117.95 MHz. Lines drawn from the VOR station in a particular magnetic direction are radials. The amplitude-modulated variable phase signal and the frequency-modulated reference phase signal of a very high-frequency omnidirectional range station used for aircraft navigation are synchronized so that both signals are in phase with each other at blank of the VOR station. 360 degrees north magnetic bearing position. What is the main underlying operating principle of the very high-frequency omnidirectional range aircraft navigational system? A phase difference between two AC voltages may be used to determine an aircraft's azimuth position in relation to a selected VOR station. What is the frequency range of the localizer beam system used by aircraft to find the center line of a runway during an instrument landing system approach to an airport? 108.10 MHz to 111.95 MHz. What is the frequency range of the marker beacon system used to indicate an aircraft's position during an instrument landing system approach to an airport's runway? The outer, the middle, and the inner marker beacons carrier frequencies are all 75 MHz, but the marker beacons are 95% tone modulated at 400 Hz, 1300 Hz, and 3000 Hz. Which of the following is a required component of an instrument landing system? Localizer shows aircraft deviation horizontally from center of runway. What type of antenna is used in an aircraft's instrument landing system glide slope installation? A folded dipole reception antenna. Choose the only correct statement about the localizer beam system used by aircraft to find the center line of a runway during an instrument landing system approach to an airport. The localizer beam system produces two amplitude-modulated antenna patterns, one pattern with an audio frequency of 90 Hz and one pattern with an audio frequency of 150 Hz, one left of the runway center line and one right of the runway center line. Produces two amplitude-modulated antenna patterns, one pattern with an audio frequency of 90 Hz and one pattern with an audio frequency of 150 Hz, one left of the runway center line and one right of the runway center line. On runway approach, an ILS localizer shows deviation left or right of runway centerline. What is the frequency range of an aircraft's automatic direction finding equipment? 190 kHz to 1750 kHz. What is meant by the term night effect when using an aircraft's automatic direction finding equipment? Night effect refers to the fact that non-directional beacon transmissions can bounce off the Earth's ionosphere at night and be received at almost any direction. What are the transmit and receive frequencies of an aircraft's Mode C transponder operating in the air traffic control radar beacon system? Transmit at 1090 MHz and receive at 1030 MHz. What are the transmit and receive frequencies of an aircraft's Mode C transponder operating in the air traffic control radar beacon system? Transmit at 1090 MHz and receive at 1030 MHz. In addition to duplicating the functions of a Mode C transponder, an aircraft's Mode S transponder can also provide mid-air collision avoidance capabilities. What type of encoding is used in an aircraft's Mode C transponder transmission to a ground station of the air traffic control radar beacon system? Pulse position modulation. Choose the only correct statement about an aircraft's automatic direction finding equipment. An aircraft's ADF antennas can receive transmissions that are over the Earth's horizon, since these signals will follow the curvature of the Earth. What type of antenna pattern is radiated from a ground station phased array directional antenna when transmitting the ppm pulses in a Mode S interrogation signal of an aircraft's traffic alert and collision avoidance system installation? 1030 MHz directional pattern. What type of antenna is used in an aircraft's instrument landing system marker beacon installation? A balanced loop reception antenna. What is the frequency range of an aircraft's very high frequency communications? 118.000 MHz to 136.975 MHz. Aircraft emergency locator transmitters operate on what frequencies? 121.5, 243 and 406 MHz. What is the frequency range of an aircraft's radio altimeter? 4250 MHz to 4350 MHz. What type of antenna is attached to an aircraft's Mode C transponder installation and used to receive 1030 MHz interrogation signals from the air traffic control radar beacon system? An L-band monopole blade type omnidirectional antenna. Some aircraft and avionics equipment operates with a prime power line frequency of 400 Hz, What is the principal advantage of a higher line frequency? The magnetic devices in a 400 Hz power supply such as transformers, chokes and filters are smaller and lighter than those used in 60 Hz power supplies. Aviation services use predominantly blank microphones. Dynamic. Typical airborne HF transmitters usually provide a nominal RF power output to the antenna at blank watts compared with blank watts RF output from a typical VHF transmitter. 120. Before ground testing an aircraft radar, the operator should ensure that the area in front of the antenna is clear of other maintenance personnel to avoid radiation hazards. What type of antenna is used in an aircraft's very high-frequency omnidirectional range and localizer installations? Horizontally polarized omnidirection reception antenna. What is the function of a commercial aircraft cell installation? Cell is a type of aircraft communications blank system where a ground-based transmitter can call a selected aircraft or group of aircraft without the flight crew monitoring the ground station frequency. What is a 1/2 digit on a DMM? Partial extended accuracy on lower part of the range. A 50 microampere movement has an internal resistance of 2000 ohms. What applied voltage is required to indicate half-scale deflection? 0.05 volts. What is the purpose of a series multiplier resistor used with a voltmeter? It is used to increase the voltage indicating range of the voltmeter. What is the purpose of a shunt resistor used with an ammeter? It is used to increase the ampere indicating range of the ammeter. What instrument is used to indicate high and low digital voltage states? Logic probe. What instrument may be used to verify proper radio antenna functioning? An SWR meter. How is a frequency counter used? To measure the time between events or the frequency which is the reciprocal of the time. What is a frequency standard? A device used to produce a highly accurate reference frequency. What equipment may be useful to track down ME aboard a ship or aircraft? Portable AM receiver. On an analog wattmeter, what part of the scale is most accurate and how much does that accuracy extend to the rest of the reading scale? The accuracy is only at full scale and that absolute number reading is carried through to the rest of the range. The upper 1/3 of the meter is the only truly calibrated part. The accuracy is only at full scale and that absolute number reading is carried through to the rest of the range. The upper 1/3 of the meter is the only truly calibrated part. Which of the following frequency standards is used as a time-based standard by field technicians? Rubidium standard. Which of the following contains a multirange AF voltmeter calibrated in decibel and a sharp internal 1000 Hz bandstop filter, both used in conjunction with each other to perform quieting tests? Synod meter. What is used to decrease circuit loading when using an oscilloscope? 10-1 divider probe. How does a spectrum analyzer differ from a conventional oscilloscope? The oscilloscope is used to display electrical signals in the time domain while the spectrum analyzer is used to display electrical signals in the frequency domain. What stage determines the maximum frequency response of an oscilloscope? Vertical amplifier. What factors limit the accuracy, frequency response, and stability of an oscilloscope? Sweep oscillator quality and deflection amplifier bandwidth. An oscilloscope can be used to accomplish all of the following except measure velocity of light with the aid of a light-emitting diode. What instrument is used to check the signal quality of a single sideband radio transmission? Oscilloscope. A blank and blank can be combined to measure the characteristics of transmission lines. Such an arrangement is known as a time domain reflectometer. Oscilloscope pulse generator. What does the horizontal axis of a spectrum analyzer display? Frequency. What does the vertical axis of a spectrum analyzer display? Amplitude. What instrument is most accurate when checking antennas and transmission lines at the operating frequency of the antenna? Frequency domain reflectometer. What test instrument can be used to display spurious signals in the output of a radio transmitter? A spectrum analyzer. What instrument is commonly used by radio service technicians to monitor frequency modulation, check receiver sensitivity, distortion, and to generate audio tones? Service monitor. Can a P25 radio system be monitored with a scanner? Yes, if the scanner has P25 decoding. Which of the following answers is true? The RF power reading on a CDMA radio is not accurate on an analog power meter. What is a common method used to program radios without using a wired connection? Infrared communication. What is the common method for determining the exact sensitivity specification of a receiver? Measure the recovered audio for 12 decibels of SINED. A communications technician would perform a modulation acceptance bandwidth test in order to determine the effective bandwidth of a communications receiver. What is the maximum FM deviation for voice operation of a normal wideband channel on VHF and UHF? 5.0 kHz. When soldering or working with CMOS electronics products or equipment, a wrist strap must have less than 100,000 ohms of resistance to prevent static electricity. Which of the following is the preferred method of cleaning solder from plated through circuit board holes? Use a vacuum device. What is the proper way to cut plastic wire ties? With flush cut diagonal pliers and cut flush. The ideal method of removing insulation from wire is the thermal stripper. A hot gas bonder is used for non-contact melting of solder. When repairing circuit board assemblies, it is most important to wear safety glasses. What color is the binder for pairs 51 to 75 in a 100 pair cable? Green. What is most important when routing cables in a mobile unit? Assuring radio or electronics cables do not interfere with the normal operation of the vehicle. Why should you not use white or translucent plastic tie wraps on a radio tower? UV radiation from the sun deteriorates the plastic very quickly. What is the 6-pair color code in a 25-pair switchboard cable as is found in building telecommunications interconnections? Red, blue, blue, red. What tolerance of plumb should a single base station radio rack be installed? Just inside the bubble on a level. What type of wire would connect an SSB automatic tuner to an insulated backstay? GTO 15 high voltage cable. On a 150-watt marine SSB HF transceiver, what would be indicated by a steady output of 75 watts when keying the transmitter on? There is probably a defect in the system causing the carrier to be transmitted. The tachometer of a building's elevator circuit experiences interference caused by the radio system nearby. What is a common potential fix for the problem? Add a 0.01 F capacitor across the motor tachometer leads. A common method of programming portable or mobile radios is to use a laptop computer. In a software-defined transceiver, what would be the best way for a technician to make a quick overall evaluation of the radio's operational condition? Use the built-in self-test feature. How might an installer verify correct GPS sentence to marine DSC VHF radio? Look for latitude and longitude on the display. What steps must be taken to activate the DSC emergency signaling function on a marine VHF? Input of registered 9-digit MMSI. What term describes a wide bandwidth communications system in which the RF carrier frequency varies according to some predetermined sequence? Spread spectrum communication. Name 2 types of spread spectrum systems used in most RF communications applications: direct sequence and frequency hopping. What is the term used to describe a spread spectrum communications system where the center frequency of a conventional carrier is altered many times per second in accordance with a pseudo-random list of channels? Frequency hopping. A TDMA radio uses what to carry the multiple conversations sequentially? Separate time slots. Which of the following statements about SSB voice transmissions is correct? They normally use J3 emissions, which consists of one sideband and a suppressed carrier. Which of the following statements about SSB voice transmissions is correct? They normally use J3 emissions, which consists of one sideband and a suppress carrier. What are the two most used PCS coding techniques used to separate different calls? CDMA and GSM. What is a codec? A coder-decoder IC or circuitry that converts a voice signal into a predetermined digital format for encrypted transmission. The GSM uses what type of codec for digital mobile radio system communications? Regular pulse excited. Which of the following codes has gained the widest acceptance for exchange of data from one computer to another? ASCII. The International Organization for Standardization has developed a 7-level reference model for a packet radio communication structure. What level is responsible for the actual transmission of data and handshaking signals? The physical layer. What codec is used in Phase 2 P25 radios? AMB. The International Organization for Standardization has developed a 7-level reference model for a packet radio communication structure. The blank level arranges the bits into frames and controls data flow. Link layer. What is a SDR? Software-defined radio. What does the DSP not do in a modern DSP radio? Control SWR. Which statement best describes the code used for GMDSS DSC transmissions? A 10-bit error-correcting code starting with bits of data followed by a 3-bit error-correcting code. Which is the code used for side array and B transmissions? Each character consists of 7 bits with 4 zeros and 3 ones. Which of the following statements is true? The idle signal is used for FCC phasing signal 1. What principle allows multiple conversations to be able to share one radio channel on a GSM channel? Time division multiplex. What is the channel spacing used for VHF marine radio? 25 kHz. What VHF channel is assigned for distress and calling? Channel 16. What VHF channel is used for digital selective calling and acknowledgement? Channel 70. Maximum allowable frequency deviation for VHF marine radios is +/5 kHz. What is the reason for the USA in control or function? It changes some channels that are normally duplex channels into simplex channels. How might an installer verify correct GPS sentence to marine DSC VHF radio? Look for latitude and longitude plus speed on VHF display. What is a common occurrence when voice testing an SSB aboard a boat? Voltage panel indicator lamps may glow with each syllable. What might contribute to apparent low voltage on marine SSB transmitting? Blown black negative fuse. What type of wire connects an SSB automatic tuner to an insulated backstay? GTO15 high voltage cable. Which of the following statements concerning CIDR communications is true? ARQ message transmissions are made in data groups consisting of 3-character blocks. The sequence ARQ FEC SPEC best corresponds to which of the following sequences? Two-way communications, one-way communications to all stations, one-way communications to a single station. Which of the following statements concerning CIDR communications is true? Two-way communication with the coast radio station using FEC is not necessary to be able to receive the broadcasts. What causes the SART to begin a transmission? After being activated, the SART responds to radar interrogation. How should the signal from a search and rescue radar transponder appear on a radar display? A series of 12 equally spaced dots. In which frequency band does a search and rescue transponder operate? 9 GHz. Which piece of required GMDSS equipment is the primary source of transmitting locating signals? An EPIRB transmitting on 406 MHz. Which of the following statements concerning satellite EPIRBs is true? Once activated, these EPIRBs transmit a signal for use in identifying the vessel and for determining the position of the beacon. What statement is true regarding 406 MHz EPIRB transmissions? Transmits a unique hexadecimal identification number. What is facsimile? The transmission of printed pictures for permanent display on paper. What is the standard scan rate for high-frequency 3 MHz-23 MHz weather facsimile reception from shore stations? 120 lines per minute. What would be the bandwidth of a good crystal lattice bandpass filter for weather facsimile HF reception? 1 kHz at -6 decibels. Which of the following statements about Navtex is true? Receives MSI broadcasts using CIDR B or FEC mode. Which of the following is the primary frequency that is used exclusively for Navtex broadcasts internationally? 518 kHz. What determines whether a Navtex receiver does not print a particular type of message content? The subject indicator matches that programmed for rejection by the operator. What data language is bidirectional multi-transmitter multi-receiver network? NMEA 2000. How should shielding be grounded on an NMEA 01A3 data line? Terminated to ground at the talker and unterminated at the listener. What might occur in NMEA 2000 network topology if one device in line should fail? There will be no interruption to all other devices. In an NMEA 2000 device, a load equivalence number of 1 is equivalent to how much current consumption? 50 mA. An NMEA 2000 system with devices in a single location may be powered using this method. N-powered network. What voltage drop at the end of the last segment will satisfy NMEA 2000 network cabling plans? 1.5 volts. What is the normal range of pulse repetition rates? 500 to 2000 pps. The radar range in nautical miles to an object can be found by measuring the elapsed time during a radar pulse and dividing this quantity by 12.346 s. What is the normal range of pulse widths? 0.05 s to 1.0 s. Shipboard radar is most commonly operated in what band? SHF. The pulse repetition rate of a radar refers to the pulse rate of the magnetron. If the elapsed time for a radar echo is 62 microseconds, what is the distance in nautical miles to the object? 5 nautical miles. The ATR box prevents the received signal from entering the transmitter. What is the purpose or function of the radar duplexer circulator? It is an electronic switch that allows the use of one antenna for both transmission and reception. What device can be used to determine the performance of a radar system at sea? Echo box. What is the purpose of a synchro transmitter and receiver? Transmits the angular position of the antenna to the indicator unit. Digital signal processing of radar signals causes improved weak signal or target enhancement. The component or circuit providing the transmitter output power for a radar system is the magnetron. When a radar is being operated on the 48-mile range setting, what is the most appropriate pulse width and pulse repetition rate? 1.0 SPW and 500 pps. When a radar is being operated on the 6-mile range setting, what is the most appropriate pulse width and pulse repetition rate? 0.25 SPW and 1000 pps. We are looking at a target 25 miles away. When a radar is being operated on the 25-mile range setting, what is the most appropriate pulse width and pulse repetition rate? 1.0 SPW and 500 pps. What pulse width and repetition rate should you use at long ranges? Wide pulse width and slow repetition rate. What pulse width and repetition rate should you use at short ranges? Narrow pulse width and fast repetition rates. When a radar is being operated on the 1.5-mile range setting, what is the most appropriate pulse width and pulse repetition rate? 0.05 SPW and 2000 pps. How does the gain of a parabolic dish antenna change when the operating frequency is doubled? Gain increases 6 decibels. What type of antenna or pickup device is used to extract the radar signal from the waveguide? J-Hawk. What happens to the beam width of an antenna as the gain is increased? The beam width decreases as the gain is increased. A common shipboard radar antenna is the slotted array. Conductance takes place in a waveguide through electromagnetic and electrostatic fields in the walls of the waveguide. To couple energy into and out of a waveguide, use a thin piece of wire as an antenna. The permanent magnetic field that surrounds a traveling wave tube is intended to prevent the electron beam from spreading. Prior to testing any radar system, the operator should first assure no personnel are in front of the antenna. In the term ARPA radar, ARPA is the acronym for which of the following? Automatic radar plotting aid. Which of the following is not a precaution that should be taken to ensure the magnetron is not weakened? Keep the TR properly tuned. Exposure to microwave energy from radar or other electronics devices is limited by U.S. Health Department regulations to blank megawatt per centimeter. 5.0. Radar collision avoidance systems utilize inputs from each of the following except your ship's anemometer. What is the orbiting altitude of the Iridium satellite communications system? 485 miles. What frequency band is used by the Iridium system for telephone and messaging? 1616-1626 MHz. What services are provided by the Iridium system? Digital voice and data at 2.4 kbps. Which of the following statements about the Iridium system is true? There are 48 spot beams per satellite with a footprint of 30 miles in diameter. What is the main function of the COSPA-SARSAT satellite system? Monitor 406 MHz for distress calls from EPIRBs. How does the COSPA-SARSAT satellite system determine the position of a ship in distress? By measuring the Doppler shift of the 406 MHz signal taken at several different points in its orbit. What is the orbital altitude of Inmarsat satellites? 22,177 miles. Which of the following describes the Inmarsat satellite system? ARE at 15.5 W, ARW at 54 W, POR at 178 E and IOR at 64.5 E. What are the directional characteristics of the Inmarsat CSES antenna? Very narrow beam width straight up from the top of the antenna. When engaging in voice communications via an Inmarsat B terminal, what techniques are used? Codecs are used to digitize the voice signal. Which of the following statements concerning Inmarsat geostationary satellites is true? They provide coverage to vessels in nearly all of the world's navigable waters. Which of the following conditions can render Inmarsat B communications impossible? All of these: an obstruction, such as a mast causing disruption of the signal between the satellite and the SES antenna when the vessel is steering a certain course. A satellite whose signal is on a low elevation below the horizon travel beyond the effective radius of the satellite. What is the best description for the Inmarsat C system? It is a store and forward system that provides routine and distress communications. The Inmarsat Mini-M system is a satellite system utilizing spot beams to provide for small craft communications. What statement best describes the Inmarsat B services? Voice at 16 kbps, fax at 14.4 kbps and high-speed data at 64/54. Which Inmarsat systems offer high-speed data at 64/54 kbps? B. M4 and Fleet. When Inmarsat B and Inmarsat C terminals are compared, Inmarsat C antennas are small and omnidirectional, while Inmarsat B antennas are larger and directional. When Inmarsat B and Inmarsat C terminals are compared, Inmarsat C antennas are small and omnidirectional, while Inmarsat B antennas are larger and directional. What services are provided by the Inmarsat M service? Voice at 6.2 kbps, data at 2.4 kbps, fax at 2.4 kbps and email. Global Positioning Service satellite orbiting altitude is 12,554 miles. The GPS transmitted frequencies are 1,227.6 MHz and 1,575.4 MHz. How many GPS satellites are normally in operation? 24. What best describes the GPS satellite's orbits? They are in 6 orbital planes equally spaced and inclined about 55 degrees to the equator. How many satellites must be received to provide complete position and time? 4. What is DGPS? A system to provide additional correction factors to improve position accuracy. Compliance with MPE, or maximum permissible exposure to RF levels for controlled environments, are averaged over blank minutes, while uncontrolled RF environments are averaged over blank minutes. 6:30. Sites having multiple transmitting antennas must include antennas with more than blank % of the maximum permissible power density exposure limit when evaluating RF site exposure. 5. RF exposure from portable radio transceivers may be harmful to the eyes because RF heating may cause cataracts. At what aggregate power level is an MPE study required? 1000 watts ERP. At what aggregate power level is an MPE study required? 1000 watts ERP. Why must you never look directly into a fiber optic cable? An active fiber signal may burn the retina and infrared light cannot be seen. If the MPE power is present, how often must the personnel accessing the affected area be trained and certified? Yearly. What device can protect a transmitting station from a direct lightning hit? There is no device to protect a station from a direct hit from lightning. What is the purpose of not putting sharp corners on the ground leads within a building? Lightning will jump off of the ground lead because it is not able to make sharp bends. Should you use a power drill without eye protection? No. What class of fire is one that is caused by an electrical short circuit, and what is the preferred substance used to extinguish that type of fire? Fe30. Do shorted stub lightning protectors work at all frequencies? No, only at the tune frequency band. What is a GFI electrical socket used for? To prevent electrical shock by sensing ground path current and shutting the circuit down.